Hi, folks. My name is Rahul Prakash. I'm a product lead in the identity division at Microsoft, and I'm here with my colleague, Balaji Parimi, to show you some simple yet highly effective ways to achieve zero standing privileges in your multi-cloud environment using some of the latest capabilities in Microsoft Entra. Getting to zero standing privileges will allow you to reinforce your zero trust security by removing any persistent, always-on permissions consistently across clouds. Before we dive in, here's a quick overview of what we'll cover. First, Balaji will walk us through the specificities of multi-cloud and its challenges when it comes to permissions and privileged access management. Then we'll move on to a series of demos to illustrate the framework you can put in place today in your own environment to discover, remediate, and monitor permissions across clouds. So let's jump right into it. Balaji, on to you.
Hi, I'm Balaji Parimi. I'm the founder of CloudKnox, which became Microsoft Entra Permissions Management, our cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution. In the past, most of the ID infrastructure and apps of an enterprise were in the confines of a well-defined perimeter. Most identities were human identities, and all of them were operating within this perimeter. Over time, more and more organizations' assets are living beyond the organizational boundaries. This trend really exploded with the adoption of SaaS apps. The advent of cloud computing, including IaaS and PaaS, is really making the perimeter disappear. Most of the enterprises are adopting hybrid and multi-cloud architecture for strategic reasons. Finally, automation reached unprecedented levels. Today, all it takes is one line of code to do almost anything, intentionally or unintentionally. The consequence is that more and more identities are now holding what we can call superpowers. Couple this with the DevOps revolution, the number of identities operating in the environment has increased exponentially, especially non-human identities like virtual machines, containers, access keys, etc. All of these identities need permissions to operate, causing massive permission proliferation. The old methods of managing permissions rely on static ways to assign permissions based on assumptions, like employee's job title or department, for example. That leads to massive over-provisioning, resulting in a huge gap between the total permissions granted and the permissions that are actually used. We created a metric to measure this gap called the permission creep index. And based on what we observed with our customers so far, on average, over 90% of identities use less than 5% of the permissions they are granted, meaning that 95% of the permissions are unused, are excessive, and represent a potential security threat for the organization. If left unmanaged, these permissions gap keeps growing as new identities, new services, and APIs are added. This poses a huge risk, as the bigger the permission gap, the bigger the door attackers can use to breach an organization and steal sensitive assets. Achieving zero standing privileges is an absolute necessity. Now we'll walk through how we can address this problem by following a simple framework. To solve this challenge, we need to adopt a holistic approach, as the cloud infrastructure is very dynamic in nature. We need to discover all the identities that are operating in the environment, assess risk, and plan proper remediation to minimize the risk. For the rest of the presentation, we're going to go deep into demos to show you how you can discover these identities and the permissions they have, remediate over-permissioned identities, and automate the continuous monitoring and governance workflows to make sure that you stay healthy. Let's start with the first step, discovering all permissions across clouds. Let's get into a real-world example and then walk you through some demos. Let's take the example of Woodgrove Bank. Rihanna is on the security team at Woodgrove Bank, and she just learned that Woodgrove's #1 competitor had a security incident due to a misuse of permissions. She constantly hears that such incidents are on the rise and doesn't want to be in the news. We'll show you what she can do about it using Microsoft technology. First, we'll show you how Rihanna takes a data-driven approach to discover and assess the sprawl of identities and their permissions across her cloud environments. And then we'll see how she learns about what those identities are actually using for their day-to-day operations. First, Rihanna navigates to the Entra admin center at entra.microsoft.com and then to permissions management. She lands on the permissions management dashboard. Here, she can get a big picture view of the identities and their permissions across her multi-cloud environment. She's currently looking at her Azure environment that counts a total of 848 identities. Many of these identities have a high number of unused permissions. The permission creep index, which is the metric that allows to measure the gap between permissions granted and permissions used, is reaching 83 out of 100, which is considered high permission risk and is therefore to the right in the red area of the chart. She can hover over the 848 to see that 648 identities are considered to have high risk permissions. Similarly, she switches over to her AWS environment where she sees 73 identities, 13 of which are considered to have high risk permissions and are contributing to a PCI score of 97. She clicks into the 73 to see more detailed information about these identities. Here, she can see a clear breakdown between users, roles, and resources to pinpoint exactly where the risk is coming from. On the bottom left, she can see some more information such as number of inactive users, inactive apps, etc. And back to Azure, she can click into the 848 to view a breakdown by users, applications, and managed identities. She wants to get even more details about these identities, so she clicks on the Analytics tab, where she sees line by line every single identity in her specific cloud environment, the number of permissions granted to each, and more importantly, how many of those permissions have been used in the last 90 days. For instance, she sees that Martin Ballas has been granted over 12,000 permissions in Azure subscription through roles, groups, you name it. And he has only executed 100 permissions in the last 90 days. That means he is using less than 1% of his granted permissions. Similarly, for AWS, Rihanna can see that Katerina here has a PCI score of 99, has over 10,000 permissions granted to her, but she too is only using a tiny fraction of those. And in fact, her last activity was 68 days ago. With a metric like permission creep index, Rihanna didn't have to spend much time to understand the intricacies of each of her IaaS services. She quickly learned about which identities have excessive unused high-risk permissions across her multi-cloud. Let's pause here for a minute and recap what Rihanna was able to do in just a few minutes. Rihanna was quickly able to learn about all the identities, human workload, serverless functions, EC2 instance, etc., and their permissions in their multi-cloud infrastructure. She learned that most identities only used a tiny fraction of their assigned permissions, and with a metric like permission creep index, she was able to adopt a data-driven approach to understand how much risk there was in her environment. And now, Rahul is going to take us through the next scenarios. Rahul, over to you.
Thanks, Balaji. This brings us to the next part of Rihanna's journey at Woodgrove Bank. Now, Rihanna knows a lot more about her environment. Which identities exist across her large multi-cloud landscape, what permissions they have, and what permissions they've been using. Naturally, the number of identities and the unused high-risk permissions they have is a great concern to her, as they pose unnecessary and avoidable risk. She wants to do something about it. More specifically, Rihanna is now aware that Martin and Katerina have many unused high-risk permissions. Equipped with this knowledge, Rihanna now wants to reduce these unused high-risk permissions. But she wants to do it in a way that doesn't hamper their productivity, even in any one-off or war room type scenarios. Rihanna's game plan is as follows. First, remove all the unused high-risk permissions. In short, she's going to right-size these permissions. Second, enable them to acquire permissions on demand when they need them. We'll start with right-sizing permissions for Martin. Rihanna navigates to the Remediation tab in Entra Permissions Management. And under Permissions, she searches for Martin. She sees a granular list of permissions granted to him by resource. She can create a custom role that is limited to what Martin actually used in the last 90 days. Under Remediation, she navigates to Roles/Policies and creates a custom role with only the set of permissions that Martin needs, determined based on his usage in the past 90 days. To further secure her environment, Rihanna wants to take the steps to achieve zero standing privileges. She does this through privileged identity management and permissions on demand. From the analytics, Rihanna learned that Martin had used only a tiny fraction of his permissions to Azure Storage. To enable Martin to acquire these Azure Storage permissions, she navigates to privileged identity management in the Entra Admin Center and sets him up for eligible owner access to the Azure Blob storage. This is the account that he needs to service on a daily basis. She configures it in such a way that his request will be auto-approved and the assignment will auto-expire after 12 hours. Next, we'll move on to Katerina. Katerina is an auditor at Woodgrove Bank who needs permissions to get some configuration details across Azure and AWS from time to time on an ad hoc basis. For her, Rihanna adds Katerina as a requester in permissions on demand. From here, Katerina can request permissions to read configuration of any resource she needs at the time she needs it, and the request will be automatically forwarded through to Rihanna for her approval. In this way, Rihanna has effectively used the controls to right-size Martin's permissions, move closer to zero standing privileges by replacing his standing access using privileged identity management, and reduce Katerina's standing permissions to Azure and AWS by using permissions on demand. While these are disparate products for now, we are doing the work to bring them together in the future. To recap, Rihanna was able to revoke unused and underused risky permissions across her multi-cloud environment, right-size them based on usage patterns instead of static assumptions like role or job function, and lay the groundwork for zero standing privileges by enabling on-demand and just-in-time capabilities. So now that Rihanna has gotten a detailed view of her multi-cloud environment and has put in the time and done the work to right-size these permissions and enabled just-in-time access, she wants to make sure that her environment remains in that healthy state. The reality is that for her to effectively manage these hundreds, thousands of identities at scale, she needs a policy-based automation workflows with delegation capabilities. For example, she might want a policy that reads something like this: all user identities with a permission creep index score of over 50 must be reviewed by their managers, and all workload identities by their respective owners. While our teams at Microsoft are working hard to bring such automation capabilities to you, we'll give you a glimpse into some of the workflows that exist today. In the next demo, we'll show you how Rihanna uses continuous monitoring and access reviews workflows to make sure that permissions held by users and workload identities are reviewed periodically and that excessive permissions do not creep back in. Now that Rihanna has a good sense of which resources have the most risk associated with them, she will want to monitor for risk and have access controls in place. This is a good opportunity to review which users and workload identities have access to privileged roles. In the Identity Governance blade, under Privileged Identity Management, she selects Azure Resources and then navigates to Access Reviews under the Manage menu. She selects New, enters a name for the access review, gives it a description, and sets the recurrence cycle of the review based on what's right for her organization. Then she can select the scope to be either users or service principals. Under Role, she selects the privileged roles that she wants to review. And this way, the review will capture any user or workload identity in the organization that has access to these roles. She chooses to review identities that are either owner or storage account owners on a sensitive subscription. She can then select which reviewers should reattest access for these identities. This can either be a set of individual users or one or more groups. Once created, the Access Review service will send an email to the reviewer who will then be asked to perform the access review. And based on their response, the users and or workload identities will either retain or lose access. To recap, by integrating governance workflows with permissions management, Rihanna is able to maintain a healthy state of her environment and continuously monitor access to privileged roles and infrastructure. Through the course of this session, we showed you how Rihanna adopted a holistic approach towards zero-standing privileges. She did this through cross-cloud risk discovery, adoption of on-demand and just-in-time access to infrastructure across clouds, and by implementing governance workflows. This brings us to the end of our session, and we hope you found Rihanna's journey useful. Before we part, here are a few recommendations and resources to help you take the next step. First, please visit our documentation pages to learn more about Microsoft Entra Permissions Management and Privileged Identity Management for Azure. Then, enable Privileged Identity Management. You can find detailed guidelines at aka.ms/Azure AD PIM. And finally, get a free risk assessment of your cross-cloud permission risk by starting your 90-day trial of permissions management today. Thank you very much and have a wonderful Ignite 2022.